The air in the front parlor hung heavy with dried lavender and quiet condemnation. It was a narrow, rigid room meant to contain reverence and very little else. Ada sat upright on a straight-backed chair, her fingers laced neatly over the coarse wool of her skirt. Feeling the steady pressure of her late husband's family's stares like stones set upon her shoulders. It had been 6 months since the fever carried him away. 6 months of thinly sliced bread, careful servings, and hushed conversations that dissolved the moment she crossed a threshold. Today, the whispers had stopped altogether. Her brother-in-law, Marcus, stood before the cold hearth, clearing his throat with a rasping sound like gravel dragged across iron. He had assumed the role of patriarch without question, wearing authority as if it were a coat tailored precisely to his frame. His posture was stiff, his jaw firm with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. A paper rested in his hand, though his eyes never once dropped to read it. He had no need. The judgment had long since been decided. "Ada," he began, his tone firm and airless, "we have reviewed your circumstances with Christian compassion. Your widow's share is modest. This land does not forgive foolishness. Your idea, if it can be called that, is not a plan. It is a delusion." He allowed the words to settle like dust over the room. "To imagine you could manage alone on that barren northern tract, keeping goats in what amounts to a pit in the earth. It is disgraceful. It dishonors your husband's name." Around him, his wife, his cousins, and their spouses nodded in solemn unison. They formed a silent choir of agreement, their expressions carefully arranged into masks of pained concern that failed to conceal their relief. Ada was an inconvenience. Marcus was removing it. "Goats are unclean, restless animals," Marcus continued, finding momentum. "They are kept by drifters, not by decent women. You will fail before the first snow falls. You will starve, or you will return in humiliation, having dragged our name through the mud. That outcome is unacceptable." Ada did not respond. Her gaze remained fixed on a hairline crack in the plaster near the ceiling. Silence, she had learned, was armor they did not know how to pierce. "Therefore," Marcus went on, "we have reached a decision for your own benefit. I will incorporate your parcel into my holdings. It has little worth, but I am prepared to offer a fair sum. Enough to see you settled properly. My wife can secure you employment as a seamstress in town. You will have shelter, you will have purpose. You will be cared for." The finality in his voice left no space for refusal. This was not a negotiation, it was a pronouncement. Then slowly, Ada lowered her eyes from the crack in the plaster and met his gaze. They were clear and unwavering, carrying a depth he had never thought to search for. "No," she said. The word was soft, yet it fractured the thick air like a struck pane of glass. Marcus blinked, the faintest fissure appearing in his composure. "What did you say?" His voice dipped, edged with warning. "I said no, Marcus. The land belongs to me, the goats belong to me, and my decisions belong to me as well." She rose from the chair. There was no flutter of uncertainty in her movement. She stood with deliberate steadiness, the measured grace of someone who had found balance on unstable ground. "I will not live as a burden," she continued evenly, "and I will not be paraded as an object of charity. I appreciate your concern." She stepped toward the door. The family parted before her as though she carried contagion. At the threshold, she paused and turned once more. "You speak of shame," she said, her voice still restrained but honed now to a fine edge. "The only shame I see is in a man who would claim a widow's final inheritance and call it kindness." Then she stepped outside, leaving behind a room stunned into silence and the faint, defiant trace of her refusal lingering in the lavender-scented air. The journey north felt less like travel and more like severance. Ada carried what she could upon her back and what her 2 goats, patience and fortitude, could manage in carefully balanced panniers strapped at their sides. She had a sack of flour, a slab of salt pork, a small cast-iron pot, a sharpened knife, her husband's worn spade, and a threadbare quilt that still held the memory of shared winters. She walked away from the cluster of buildings that called itself a town without turning her head. To glance back would have been to surrender something of herself, and her future, fragile and uncertain, was the only possession she had left. With each mile, the land grew less forgiving. The soft loam of the valley receded behind her, replaced by jagged shale and hard-packed clay. Clumps of stubborn sagebrush broke through the soil, and twisted junipers stood like skeletal sentries against the wind. This was the ground Marcus had dismissed as worthless, and by ordinary standards he was correct. It would never cradle corn or cradle wheat. It was a place stripped to its bones, scoured by wind and scorched by a relentless sun. But Ada was not seeking what others sought. She was searching for what they had ignored. Her husband, a quiet man who trusted soil more than society, had spoken of this region often. He told her of fractured hills, limestone outcrops, and narrow canyons avoided by most ranchers. He described it as land that obeyed its own laws, land that protected what could not survive in open fields. She followed the dry course of a creek bed, its winding path guiding her deeper into the rugged country. The goats stepped lightly over stone and scrub, sure-footed and steady, their occasional bleats mingling with the crunch of her boots and the ceaseless murmur of wind combing through brittle grass. For 3 days she walked. Her world narrowed to the rhythm of her steps, the persistent ache in her shoulders, and the low, gnawing knot of uncertainty tightening in her stomach. On the evening of the 3rd day, she found it. The creek bed widened and opened into a concealed box canyon, a natural amphitheater shaped by centuries of water and wind. She stood at its mouth, taking in the protective curve of rock walls rising around her. From a crack in the limestone face, a thin thread of water trickled downward, gathering in a shallow basin before slipping quietly back into gravel. It was not abundant, but it was sufficient. Patches of green clung stubbornly to the canyon floor, tough grasses and deep-rooted herbs thriving where they should not. Patience and fortitude immediately lowered their heads to graze, content, and untroubled. Ada stepped forward into the shelter of stone, feeling the wind lessen, feeling something inside her settle. It was enough, and there, tucked into the north-facing wall, was the reason she had come. It was not a grand cavern, but a dark slash in the limestone, a wide, low opening that promised depth. It was a cave, its mouth partially obscured by a tumble of ancient rockfall. This was the place she had imagined, the place her quiet observations and her husband's forgotten words had led her to. She dropped her pack, the exhaustion of the journey washing over her in a great wave. She leaned against the cool rock, her hand resting on the rough limestone, feeling the deep, steady pulse of the earth beneath her palm. This was not a hole in the ground. It was a sanctuary. It was a beginning, a profound sense of purpose, stark and clear, pushed back the fear. Here she would not be a problem to be solved or a mouth to be fed. Here she would build. The first weeks were a blur of brutal, relentless labor. Ada's existence became a cycle of aching muscles and small, hard-earned victories. Her first priority was shelter for herself. A crude leaner built against the canyon wall using fallen juniper branches and the canvas from her pack. It was barely enough to keep the dew off, but it was a space that was hers. Her real efforts, her entire focus, were directed at the cave. The entrance was choked with rubble and dirt that had washed down over centuries. She had only the spade, its wooden handle worn smooth by her husband's hands and her own 2 hands. Day after day, she dug. The work was punishing. She would fill the cast iron pot with rocks and drag it away from the entrance, her back screaming in protest. Blisters formed on her palms, broke and hardened into calluses. She learned the language of the rock, distinguishing the loose scree from the stubborn embedded stones that required hours of prying and leveraging with a sturdy branch. The sun would beat down on the canyon floor, but as she worked her way deeper into the cave's opening, she felt the first reward of her labor, the cool subterranean air. It was a balm on her skin, a promise of what lay within. The goats watched her, their amber eyes following her tireless movements. They were her only companions, their gentle presence, a quiet encouragement. She would talk to them as she worked, her voice a low murmur against the scrape of stone on stone. Just a little more patience. We need to make this safe before the cold comes. At night, she would tether them near the cave mouth, where the lingering coolness of the rock offered them comfort. Her second task ran in parallel to the first, gathering fodder. The canyon provided a surprising amount of forage, but it wouldn't last the winter. Every afternoon, when the heat was at its peak and the digging became unbearable, she would take her knife and a burlap sack and venture out. She learned to identify the most nutritious grasses were the blue grandma, the buffalo grass, and the hardy winter fat shrub. She would cut them, bundle them, and haul them back to a dry ledge near the cave, creating a growing stack of winter provisions. It was a race against the seasons, a silent, desperate battle against the calendar. There were moments of despair when the sheer scale of the task threatened to overwhelm her. One evening, sitting by her small fire, her body a single, throbbing ache, she looked at the mountain of rubble she had yet to move, and the small pile of hay she had managed to gather. It felt like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. Marcus' words echoed in her mind, "You will fail before the first snow." A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. But then she looked at the dark opening of the cave, a space she had carved out with her own sweat and will. She looked at Patience and Fortitude, sleeping peacefully nearby. She was alone, yes, but she was not helpless. She was building something, not just a shelter, but a life from the bedrock up. The fear receded, replaced by a stubborn, gritty resolve. She would not fail. Inch by inch, stone by stone, she would prove them all wrong. The secret was not in the digging itself, but in the reason for it. Anyone could dig a hole. The settlers in the valley, Marcus included, saw the earth as something to be built upon. They erected their wooden barns and houses on top of the ground, exposing them to the full fury of the elements. Their structures were a testament to man's dominion over nature, standing tall and proud against the sky. They were also, as Ada knew, thermal saves. She had spent too many winters listening to the wind shriek through the cracks in a clapboard house, feeling the cold radiate from the thin walls, watching her breath plume in the air indoors. She had seen ranchers lose half their herds in a single blew, nor the animals frozen to death in the very barns built to protect them. Her idea was not born of fantasy, as Marcus had sneered, but of careful, quiet observation. Her grandfather, a man who had lived with the Ute people as a boy, had told her stories of their winter lodges, which were partially subterranean. He said they understood that the greatest source of warmth in winter was not the fire but the earth itself. The ground, he'd explained, was a massive reservoir of thermal energy. In the summer, it absorbed the sun's heat, and in the winter, it held on to that warmth with a deep, slow patience. A building above ground is at the mercy of the air temperature, which can plummet 30 or 40 degrees in a matter of hours. But 6 FT underground, the temperature remains remarkably stable, hovering in the low 50s, regardless of the blizzard raging above. This was the principle Ada was staking her life on. The cave was a natural extension of this idea. As she cleared the entrance, she could feel the truth of it. Stepping from the sun-baked canyon into the mouth of the cave was like entering another world. The air was cool and still, the oppressive heat instantly gone. The limestone walls felt cool to the touch, having absorbed the night's chill and protected it from the day's heat. In winter, the opposite would be true. The vast thermal mass of the surrounding rock would bleed its stored warmth into the enclosed space, creating an environment that was not warm, but was crucially above freezing. Cold air, she reasoned, behaved like water. It was heavy and it sank. The conventional barns with their high-peaked roofs were perfect traps for heat, which would rise and escape through 1,000 gaps in the shingles, while the cold pulled on the floor where the animals lay. Her dugout pen would be different. She was designing it with a slight downward slope from the entrance, creating a natural sump, where the coldest air would settle away from the animals' main living area. The heat from the goats' own bodies, instead of dissipating into the rafters, would be trapped within the low ceiling space, gently warming the air and the rock walls around them. It was a closed system, an exercise in conservation, not consumption. This was the knowledge that fueled her that turned the backbreaking labor into a calculated investment. Every stone she moved, every foot of earth she excavated was not just creating space. It was building a thermal battery. While Marcus and the others put their faith in sormels and iron stoves, Ada was putting her faith in geology and thermodynamics. They saw a hole in the ground, a primitive, desperate shelter. She saw a perfectly engineered machine for survival, powered by the planet itself. The breakthrough came on a sweltering afternoon in late summer. Ada was working deep inside the main chamber she had cleared, a space now roughly 20 FT long and 10 FT wide, its ceiling just high enough for her to stand upright. She was chipping away at the back wall with a sharpened edge of a flat rock, trying to smooth the surface when she heard a different sound. It wasn't the solid clink of tool on dense limestone, but a hollow, resonant thump. Her heart quickened. She tapped the spot again, listening intently. The sound was unmistakable. There was a void behind the wall. Forgetting her exhaustion, she worked with a renewed, feverish energy. She used her spade to pry at a crack near the hollow sounding spot. A small section of rock rotten with ancient water seepage crumbled away, revealing a dark opening no bigger than her fist. A draft of cool, musty air, smelling of deep earth and undisturbed time flowed out, washing over her face. It was the scent of possibility. For the next 2 days, she did nothing but attack that wall. She used a heavy juniper log as a battering ram, swinging it again and again until her arms felt like they would fall off. The rotten section of rock began to fracture and break apart. Finally, with a great groan, a large slab of the wall collapsed inward, kicking up a cloud of dust that choked the air. When it settled, she held her small lantern aloft and peered through the opening. Her breath caught in her throat. Beyond the breach was another chamber, larger and deeper than the first. It was a natural dome, its ceiling arching high above her head before disappearing into shadow. The floor was mostly level, covered in a fine, soft, dust-like silt. This discovery changed everything. Her plan had been functional but limited. Now it could be elegant. This new chamber would be the main sanctuary for the goats, spacious and protected from any drafts from the entrance. The first chamber could now be repurposed. She would build a dedicated milking area near the front where the light was better. A separate section could be used for feed storage, keeping the hay dry and away from the animals until it was needed. And most importantly, she could build a small kidding pen, a safe, isolated space for when the nannies gave birth in the spring. The vision for the dugout expanded, becoming more complex, more permanent. The build sequence began in earnest. She used the rocks from the collapsed wall to build low partitions, separating the spaces within the first chamber. The stones fit together like a puzzle, dry, stacked with a patient precision. She dug a shallow drainage channel from the milking area to the entrance, ensuring the floor would remain clean and dry. From the clay she had excavated, she mixed a plaster with water and grasses, using it to the gaps in her stone walls, making them solid and draft-proof. She constructed a milking stand not from wood, which she had little of, but from 3 large flat stones, 2 for the base and 1 for the platform. It was immovable, rustic, and perfectly functional. Day by day, the cave was transformed from a raw natural space into a deliberate, ordered environment. It was becoming a home, a barn, a fortress against the coming winter. As she worked, a quiet confidence began to settle deep in her bones. This was no longer a desperate gamble. It was a viable working system. She was not just surviving. She was engineering a small, perfect world hidden away in the heart of the rock. The first hint of another human presence came not as a sight or a sound, but as a scent on the wind. It was the smell of woodsome smoke, thin and faint but unmistakable. It came from the north, deeper in the broken hills. Ada felt a jolt of alarm. For months, her isolation had been both a burden and a shield. The canyon was her secret, her sanctuary. The thought of being discovered, of having to explain herself, of facing judgment or pity sent a chill through her. She became more cautious, extinguishing her small cooking fire before dusk and keeping the goats closer to the cave. A few days later, she saw him. He was a silhouette on the canyon rim at dawn, a tall, spare figure leaning on a long rifle, looking down into her hidden valley. He stood there for a long time, motionless, before melting back into the rocks. Fear warred with curiosity. He was not from the town. She would have recognized him. He was a man of the hills, a trapper or a prospector, someone who knew this rugged land as well as she was coming to. The encounter she dreaded came a week later. She was returning from a forage, her sack full of late-season berries, when she found him standing near the spring, letting his horse drink. He was older than she had first thought, his face a road map of wrinkles carved by sun and wind, his beard shot through with gray. He wasn't looking at her shelter or the cave, but at her goats who were watching him with placid curiosity. He turned as she approached, his movements slow and deliberate. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held no malice, only a kind of weary appraisal. "Afternoon," he said, his voice a low, growly rumble. "Didn't mean to trespass. Was tracking a mountain cat that's been bothering my traps." Ada stopped a good 10 paces away, her hand resting on the handle of her knife. "This is a free country," she said, her own voice tight. No trespass, he nodded, accepting her guardedness. Name's Jasper. I work a claim a few miles north of here. He gestured vaguely with his chin. Been seeing your sign for a while, figured it was time I made sure you weren't in any trouble. I'm not in any trouble, she stated flatly. Jasper's eyes flickered to the entrance of the cave, where the neat stack of fodder and the low, well-built stone partition were visible. He saw the clean, swept ground, the healthy sheen on the goats' coats. He was a practical man, and what he saw before him was not the camp of a desperate fool, but the homestead of a determined and competent individual. He saw order and foresight. Seems you're not, he agreed, a note of respect entering his tone. That's a fair bit of work you've done there. Most folks wouldn't have a stomach for it. He paused, his gaze returning to her. But winter's coming on fast. The northers in these hills, they don't play games, so I'm aware. Ada said the two words carrying the weight of all her months of labor. He looked at her, then truly looked at her, and saw past the dusty clothes and the weary expression. He saw the calluses on her hands and the unwavering resolve in her eyes. This was not a woman who needed rescuing. This was a woman who had already rescued herself. All right, then, he said, turning back to his horse. I'll leave you to it. But if you find yourself in need of anything a shovel can't fix, my camp is 2 canyons over. Just follow the smoke. He swung himself into the saddle with a practiced ease and rode away, leaving Ada alone once more, but with a profound and unsettling shift in her solitude. She had been seen. A week passed, and then another. Jasper did not return, and Ada fell back into the rhythm of her work, preparing for the final push before winter. The days were growing shorter, the nights colder. A fine layer of frost now greeted her each morning. The encounter with the old prospector had unsettled her, but it had also planted a seed. He had tools. He had knowledge of the mountain she lacked. And he had not judged her. He had seen her work and respected it. One morning she found a small bundle at the spring. It was wrapped in oil and tied with twine. Inside was a solid iron spade, head-worn but functional, and a small tin of axle grease. There was no note. It was a simple, practical gift, an acknowledgement from one survivor to another. It was also an invitation. She knew then that she could not afford the pride of complete self-reliance. To refuse help when it was offered so plainly was a form of foolishness, and she had no room for foolishness. The next day, she packed a small cloth with 2 rounds of the simple tangy cheese she had learned to make from the goat's surplus milk. She left patience and fortitude secured in the cave and followed the faint trail Jasper's horse had left. She found his camp in a narrow defile, a simple affair of a canvas tent, a well-ended fire, and an assortment of traps and tools. He saw her coming and simply nodded, pouring her a cup of chorry coffee from a pot on the fire. Knew that spade head would find a good home, he said by way of greeting. Thank you, Ada said, handing him the cheese. This is for you. He took it, unwrapped a corner, and cut off a piece with his skinning knife. He chewed it slowly, thoughtfully. That's good, he said, his highest form of praise. Tastes clean. Like the mountain, that simple exchange broke the dam of her isolation. They began to talk, not of the past or the people in the valley, but of the practical matters of survival. He showed her how to brace the cave entrance with a sturdy juniper beam to prevent rock falls during the freeze-thaw cycle. He had a pickaxe, a tool she had only dreamed of, and he let her borrow it. With it, she was able to level the floor of the second chamber and dig a small, deep pit for storing root vegetables she had foraged. In return, she provided him with a steady supply of fresh milk and cheese. It was a luxury he hadn't known in years, a welcome change from a diet of salted meat and hard tack. He was a font of mountain law, teaching her which lichens were edible, how to read the clouds to predict a storm, and how to bank a fire so it would smolder through the night. He never asked about her husband or why she was living alone in a cave. He accepted her presence as a fact of the landscape, like a hawk nesting on a cliff. Theirs was not a friendship of sentiment, but an alliance of necessity and mutual respect. He provided the tools and the experience she lacked. She provided the sustenance and the quiet, industrious company that eased his own solitude. One afternoon, as he helped her position the juniper beam over the cave entrance, he stopped and looked at her setup, the neat partitions, the deep bed of hay, the protected fodder. You know, he said, stroking his beard, I've been in these hills for 30 years. Seen folks try all sorts of ways to get through a winter. Most of them fail, but this just might work coming from Jasper. It was more validating than 1,000 apologies from Marcus. The first sign of the blizzard was a change in the quality of the light. The sharp crystalline autumn sun grew dull, filtered through a high, thin veil of gray cloud that bled across the sky from the north. The air became unnaturally still and heavy, and a deep, penetrating cold began to seep out of the ground. Jasper had stopped by the day before, his face grim. "It's coming," he'd said. "A bad one. The pines are moaning, and the squirrels have buried every last nut. Settle in deep. Don't you venture out." Ada had already made her final preparations. The last of the fodder was stacked high in the first chamber. The spring-fed pool was full. She had enough dried meat, flour, and foraged roots to last a month. She led Patience and Fortitude, now heavy with kid, into the deep second chamber. They settled into the thick bed of hay she had prepared, their contentment a soft, rumbling sound in the quiet of the cave. That night, the wind began to howl. It was not a whistle, but a deep guttural roar, the sound of a vast and angry beast throwing itself against the mountains. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding horizontal torrent. Ada stood for a moment at the entrance of the cave, peering through a small gap she'd left in the heavy hide she'd hung over the opening. The world outside had vanished, replaced by a churning vortex of white. The temperature plummeted. Back in the valley, she knew what would be happening. Men would be fighting their way through chest-deep drifts to their barns, their lungs burning with every breath. They would find drafts cutting through the walls like knives, water troughs frozen solid, and animals shivering violently, their energy draining away as they fought the killing cold. But inside Ada's dugout, a profound and life-giving stillness reigned. The roar of the wind was a distant, muffled hum. The air was cool but not cold. She lit her small lantern, its golden glow pushing back the subterranean darkness. The temperature inside the main chamber, she estimated, was a good 40 degrees warmer than the tempest outside. The goats were not just surviving, they were comfortable. They lay nestled together, placidly chewing their cud, their dark eyes reflecting the lantern light. Their combined body heat, trapped by the tons of rock and earth around them, created a stable, livable microclimate. She moved to the milking stand she had built. Patience, accustomed to the routine, stepped onto the stone platform without fuss. Ada sat on her small stool, her hands protected from the worst of the cold, still nimble. She leaned her head against the goat's warm flank and began to milk. The familiar rhythmic sound echoed softly in the chamber. The milk steamed in the cool air, a testament to the life and warmth that thrived in her sanctuary, a stark contrast to the deathly freeze that had conquered the world above. For 3 days the blizzard raged. Ada did not leave the cave. She moved in a calm, steady rhythm, feeding the goats, cleaning their space, milking, grinding flour for her own flatbread. She was not a prisoner of the storm. She was an island of calm in its center. This was the test. This was the moment all her labor had been for. And as she drank the fresh, warm milk, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, a quiet, unassailable sense of triumph. When the storm finally broke, the world was reborn in a shroud of blinding white and crystalline blue. The silence was as profound as the blizzard's roar had been. Ada pushed aside the heavy hide covering the entrance and looked out upon a landscape transformed. The snow was piled in massive drifts, sculpting the canyon into soft, unfamiliar shapes. It was beautiful, but it was also a prison. No one would be traveling for days. The town, the valley, Marcus, they were on another planet. A week later, when the snow had compacted enough to walk on, a figure appeared at the top of the canyon, struggling through the deep drifts. It was not Jasper. It was a man from the valley, one of her husband's cousins, a man named Thomas, who had sat silently in the parlor while Marcus delivered his verdict. His face was gaunted, his eyes hollowed out with exhaustion and fear. "Ada," he called out, his voice. "We saw the smoke from your chimney." He had seen a thin wisp from her carefully managed fire. "My boy is sick, the fever. The doctor said he needs milk, but our cow, she froze. Everyone's dead. There's no fresh milk in the whole valley." He stood there, a representative of the world that had cast her out, now begging for the one thing her foresight had produced. He didn't offer money. He knew he had nothing she needed. He was asking for mercy. Ada looked at his desperate face, and she felt no vindictiveness, only a weary pity. She went back into the cave and returned with a large pail, still warm. "Boil it first," she said, her voice even, "and tell your wife to soak cloths in the cold way for his fever." Thomas took the pail, his hands trembling. We were wrong, Ada," he stammered. "We were fools. Just take care of your son," she said, and watched him begin his long, slow journey back. News of the miracle in the broken hills traveled on hushed whispers. The story of the widow's goats, the only animals to give milk through the great blizzard, became a piece of local folklore. Marcus heard the rumors, of course, and his pride demanded he see for himself. He arrived one afternoon, his posture stiff with authority, ready to uncover the lie, or at the very least find a squalid scene he could still condemn. Ada met him at the entrance to the cave. She did not invite him in. She simply stood aside and let him look. He peered into the dim light, his eyes slowly adjusting. He saw not a filthy hole, but an ordered, functional space. He saw the healthy, pregnant goats resting on a bed of clean hay. He smelled the scent of sweet fodder and warm animals, not of filth and decay. He saw the stone partitions, the milking stand, the deep stores of grasses. He saw a system that worked with an undeniable, infuriating logic. He could not call it an embarrassment. It was an innovation. He stood there for a long time, the cold wind ruffling his hair, the silence stretching between them. He had come armed with judgment, but his weapon was useless against the simple, overwhelming evidence of her success. "I see," he said finally, the words clipped and inadequate. He turned and left without another word. His authority over her was broken, not by argument, but by the undeniable reality of warm milk in the dead of winter. That spring, Thomas returned, his healthy son in tow, and asked if Ada would show him how she had dug the channels, how she had angled the floor. Others followed, coming not with judgment, but with a new, humble curiosity. They began to see the worthless hills not as a place of exile, but as a place of opportunity. Years passed. The dugout goat pen, once the subject of ridicule, became a model for the entire region. Ada's Way, they called it. Families who had once clung precariously to the valley floor began to carve their own shelters into the hillsides, learning to work with the land instead of fighting it. They discovered that the same principles that protected goats from a blizzard could also keep a root cellar cool in the summer and a family warm through the winter. The technique saved countless livestock, and in more than a few harsh winters, human lives as well. Ada's herd grew. The two goats became 10, then 20. She never became wealthy in the way Marcus measured wealth, with acres of plowed fields and a large house. Her riches were of a different kind, the security of a full ladder, the respect of her community, and the quiet satisfaction of a life built on her own terms. She became a mentor, a quiet authority on animal husbandry and earth-sheltered building. People sought her out for her knowledge, her wisdom born not from books, but from stone and soil and observation. Jasper remained her steadfast friend and trading partner, the two of them forming a small, self-reliant outpost of practical wisdom in the wild hills. She never married again, finding a deeper companionship in her work and her chosen solitude than she had ever found in a crowded parlor. She had taken the worthless ground they had given her and found the value hidden within it. She had listened to the earth when men had offered only judgment, and it had given her everything she needed. Her story became a quiet legend, a reminder that the most powerful breakthroughs often come from daring to see the world differently, from trusting your own hands and your own mind when everyone else tells you that you are wrong. And so the question must be asked of you, what is the worthless ground in your own life? What resource, what talent, what idea have you been told is foolish, impractical, or an embarrassment? What hole in the ground are you being discouraged from digging even though some deep, quiet instinct tells you it holds the key to your survival or even your triumph? The conventional wisdom of the crowd is loud, and its judgment is swift. But perhaps the most important work you will ever do will be done in a place. No one else has the vision to look on a project. No one else has the courage to start. Perhaps it is time to pick up your spade and begin to dig. If stories of resilience and quiet defiance are what you seek, remember to return here. There are always more secrets hidden in the earth, waiting to be uncovered.